Welcome to Saturday Morning Classics. We are currently reading The Amityville Horror by Jay Anson. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back and relax, and enjoy the story. This week we're beginning with Chapter 7. December 25th. For the 7th night in a row, George awoke at exactly 3:15. He sat up in bed. In the winter moonlight flooding the bedroom, George saw Kathy quite clearly. She was sleeping on her stomach. He reached out his hand to touch her head. At that instant, Kathy woke up. As she looked wildly about, George could see the fright in her eyes. "She was shot in the head!" Kathy yelled. "She was shot in the head! I heard the explosions in my head!" Detective Gianfrido would have understood what had frightened and awakened Kathy. Filing his report after the initial investigation the night of the DeFeo murders, Gianfrido had written that Louise, the mother of the family, had been shot in the head while sleeping on her stomach. Everyone else, including her husband, who was lying right beside her, had been shot in the back while lying in the same position. This information had been included in the material turned over by the Suffolk County prosecution team, but never released to the news media. In fact, this detail had never come out, even at Ronnie DeFeo's trial. Now Kathy Lutz also knew how Louise DeFeo had died that night. She was in the very same bedroom. George held his shaken wife in his arms until she had calmed down and fallen back to sleep. Then once again the urge to check out the boathouse came over him, and George quietly slipped from the room. He was almost upon Harry in his compound when the dog awoke, springing to his feet. "Shh, Harry, it's all right. Take it easy, boy." The dog settled back on his haunches and watched George test the boathouse door. It was closed and locked. Once more he reached down and reassured Harry. "It's all right, boy. Go back to sleep." George turned and started back towards the house. George circled around the swimming pool fence. The orb of the full moon was like a huge flashlight lighting his way. He looked up at the house and stopped short. His heart leaped. From Missy's second-floor bedroom window, George could see the little girl staring at him, her eyes following his movements. "Oh, my God," he whispered aloud. Directly behind his daughter, frighteningly visible to George, was the face of a pig. He was sure he could see little red eyes glaring at him. "Missy!" he yelled. The sound of his own voice broke the grip of terror on his heart and body. George ran for the house. He pounded up the stairs to Missy's bedroom and turned on the light. She was in bed, lying on her stomach. He went to her and bent over. "Missy?" There was no answer. She was fast asleep. There was a creak behind him. He turned. Beside the window that looked out at the boathouse, Missy's little chair was slowly rocking back and forth. 6 hours later, at 9:30 in the morning, George and Kathy sat in the kitchen, drinking coffee, confused and upset with the events that were taking place in their new home. They had gone over some of the incidents each had witnessed, and now were trying to put together what was real and what they might have imagined. It was too much for them. It was December 25th, 1975, Christmas Day all over America. The promised white Christmas hadn't materialized as yet for Amityville, but it was cold enough to snow at any moment. Inside, their 3 children were in the living room, playing near the tree with what few new toys George and Kathy had managed to accumulate before moving in 8 days earlier. George figured out that in the first week he had burned over 100 gallons of oil and an entire cord of logs. Someone would have to go and buy more wood and a few groceries, such as milk and bread. He had told Kathy about trying to reach Father Mancuso on the telephone after the priest had warned him about their sewing room. Now Kathy dialed his number herself and got no answer. She reasoned that the priest might not be in his apartment because of the holiday and could be visiting his own family. Then she volunteered to go for the wood and food. There was no question as to where Father Mancuso was on this Christmas day. He was in the Sacred Heart Rectory, still suffering from the consequences of the flu. It had not disappeared in the 24 hours forecast by the doctor, and his fever had not gone below 103 degrees. The priest roamed his rooms like a caged lion, an energetic worker who loved the long hours he devoted to his calling. Father Mancuso refused to remain in bed. He had a briefcase full of files, those that were before him as a judge of court, and those of some of his psychotherapy patients. In spite of the pastor's request that he rest, the priest would put in a full day on Christmas. Above all, Father Mancuso could not shake off the uneasiness he felt about the Lutzes and their house. George heard Kathy return from her shopping. He could tell she was backing the van in because of the grinding sound the snow tires made in the driveway. For some strange reason, the noise bothered him, and he became annoyed with his wife. He went out to meet her, took 2 logs from the van, put them into the fireplace, and then sat down in the living room, refusing to unload any more. Kathy fumed. George's attitude and appearance were getting on her nerves. Somehow she could sense they were heading for a big fight, but she held her tongue for the moment. She took the bags of groceries from the van and left the remaining logs stacked inside. If George felt cold enough, Kathy knew, he'd go get them himself. She and George had cautioned Danny, Chris, and Missy to stay out of the sewing room on the 2nd floor without giving them any reason. That made the children even more curious about what might lie behind the now closed door. "It could be more Christmas presents," Chris suggested. Danny agreed, but Missy said, "I know why we have to keep out. Jody's in there." "Jody? Who's Jody?" asked Danny. "He's my friend. He's a pig." "Oh, you're such a baby, Missy. You're always making up dumb things," sneered Chris. At 6 o'clock that evening, Kathy was preparing supper for her family when she heard the sounds of something tiny and delicate striking against the glass of her kitchen window. It was dark outside, but she could see it was snowing. White flakes were tumbling down through the reflection of the kitchen light, and Kathy stared at them as the rising wind whipped the snow against the pane. "Ah, snow at last," she said. Christmas and snow. It brought a reassuring sense of familiarity to the troubled woman. She recalled her own childhood days. There always seemed to be snow at Christmas time when she was young. Kathy kept looking at the little snowflakes. Outside, the multicolored lights from the neighborhood Christmas trees gleamed through the night. Behind her, the radio was playing Christmas carols. She became peaceful in her happy kitchen nook. After supper, George and Kathy sat silently in the living room. The Christmas tree was all lit up, and George's tree-topping ornament made a beautiful addition to the decorations. Reluctantly, he had gone out to the van and brought in more of the wood. There were now 6 logs in front of the blazing fireplace, just enough to last through the night at the rate George was shoveling them in. Kathy worked on some of the children's clothes, patching the boys' trousers that were forever wearing through the knees, letting down a few of Missy's denim pants. The little girl was growing taller, and already the hems were above the tops of her shoes. At 9 o'clock, Kathy went up to the 3rd-floor playroom to get Missy ready for bed. She heard her daughter's voice coming from her bedroom. Missy was talking out loud, obviously speaking to someone else in the room. At first, Kathy thought it was one of the boys, but then she heard Missy say, "Isn't the snow beautiful, Jody?" When Kathy entered, her daughter was sitting in her little rocker by the window, staring at the falling snow outside. Kathy looked around the bedroom. There was no one there. "Who are you talking to, Missy? An angel?" Missy looked around at her mother. Then her eyes went back to a corner of the room. "No, Mama, just Jody." Kathy turned her head to follow Missy's glance. There was nothing there but some of Missy's toys on the floor. "Jody? Is that one of your new dolls?" "No, Jody's a pig. He's my friend. Nobody can see him but me." Kathy knew that Missy, like other children of her age, often created people and animals to talk to, so she assumed it was the child's imagination at work again. George had not yet told her of the incident in Missy's room the night before. There was another surprise waiting for Kathy when she got to the top floor a few minutes later. Danny and Chris were already in their own bedroom, changing into their pajamas. Usually both boys fought to stay up past 10. This night, at 9:30, they were getting ready without being told. Kathy wondered why. "What's the matter with you two? How come you're not arguing about going to sleep?" Her sons shrugged, continuing to undress. "It's warmer in here, Mama," Danny said. "We don't want to play in there anymore." When Kathy checked in there, she was struck by the freezing chill in the playroom. No windows were open, yet the room was ice cold. It certainly wasn't uncomfortable in Danny and Chris's bedroom, nor in the hallway. She felt the radiator. It was hot. Kathy told George about the cold in the upstairs playroom. Too comfortable by the fireplace to want to move, he said he'd check it out in the morning. At midnight, Kathy and George finally went to bed. The snow had stopped falling in Amityville, as it had 15 miles away outside the Sacred Heart Rectory in North Merrick. Father Mancuso turned away from his window. His head hurt. His stomach pained from the flu cramps. The priest was perspiring, and the feeling of suffocating heat made him take off his bathrobe. When he did remove the robe, he began to shiver with a fit of uncontrollable chills. Father Mancuso couldn't wait to get back into bed. It was cold under the blanket, and he realized he could see his breath in the air. "What the hell's going on?" he muttered to himself. The priest reached out to touch the radiator next to the bed. There was absolutely no heat. The sick man now felt his body starting to sweat again. Father Mancuso burrowed deep under the blanket, curling up in a tight ball. He closed his eyes and began to pray. Chapter 8. December 26th. One night, George doesn't remember exactly which, he awoke again at 3:15 in the morning. He dressed and went out, and as he was wandering around in the freezing darkness, he wondered what in God's name he was looking for in the boathouse. Harry, their tough half-breed watchdog, didn't even wake up when George stumbled over some loose wire near Harry's compound. When the Lutzes lived in Deer Park, Harry also had his own doghouse and slept outside in all kinds of weather. Normally he would remain awake, on guard, until 2 or 3 in the morning before finally settling down and going to sleep. Any unfamiliar noise would bring Harry to alert attention. Since they had moved to 112 Ocean Avenue, the dog was usually fast asleep whenever George went out to the boathouse. He would awake only when his master called to him. George vividly remembers the day after Christmas, however, because that was the date set for Jimmy's wedding. It was also the beginning of a severe case of diarrhea he developed after checking out the boathouse. The pain was intense at first, almost as if a knife had pierced his stomach. George became frightened when he felt nausea rising in his throat. As soon as he re-entered the house, he made a dash for the bathroom on the first floor. It was daylight outside when he settled back into bed. The abdominal cramps were intense, but finally he fell asleep out of sheer exhaustion. Kathy awoke a few moments later and immediately roused him to remind him of the wedding affair that evening. There would be a lot of arrangements to be handled before her brother came to pick them up. She would be busy with her clothes and hair. George groaned in his half-sleep. Before going down to prepare breakfast for herself and the children, Kathy went up to the third floor to check the playroom. It was still cold inside when she opened the door, but not as icy as the day before. George might not like to move from his fire, but he would just have to in order to check the radiator. It was working all right, but there was no heat in the room. Certainly the children couldn't stay in there any length of time, and Kathy wanted them out of the way until it was time for them to dress for the wedding. She looked out of the window and saw the ground covered with slush from the melted snow. That settled it. The three would remain indoors today. She decided they would have to play in their own bedrooms. After they were fed, Missy obediently started up to her own bedroom. Kathy warned her that she was not to go into the sewing room, that she was not even to open the door. "That's okay, Mama. Jody wants to play in my room today." "That's my good girl," Kathy smiled. "You go and play with your friend." The boys wanted to play outside, arguing that this was their Christmas vacation from school. It was the way they persisted and answered her back that angered Kathy. Danny and Chris never questioned her requests before this, and she was becoming more aware that her two sons had also changed since they had been in the new house. But Kathy was not yet aware of her own personality changes, her impatience and crankiness. "That's enough out of both of you," she yelled at her sons. "I see you're asking for another beating. Now shut your mouths and get up to your room like I said, and stay there until I call you. You hear me? Scat! Upstairs!" Sullenly, Danny and Chris mounted the stairs to the third floor, passing George on his way down. He didn't acknowledge them. They didn't say good morning to him. In the dinette, George took one sip of coffee, clutched his stomach, and headed back upstairs to his bathroom. "Don't forget you've got to shave and shower today," Kathy yelled after him. Considering George's speed in running up the stairs, she wasn't sure he had heard her. Kathy returned to her breakfast nook. She had been making up a shopping list, checking items in the refrigerator and cabinets that needed to be replaced. Food was again running low, and she knew she just had to get herself up and out of the house. She couldn't depend on George to do it. The big freezer in the basement, one of the free items they had received from the DeFeo estate, was clean and could be filled with meats and frozen foods. Her cleaning materials were almost exhausted since she had been scrubbing the toilet bowls day after day. Most of the blackness was gone by now. Kathy planned to go to an Amityville supermarket the next morning, Saturday. She wrote orange juice on her pad. Suddenly she became aware of a presence in the kitchen. In Kathy's current state of mind over the eroding situation of her family, the memory of the first touch on her hand flooded back, and she froze. Slowly, Kathy looked over her shoulder. She could see the kitchen was empty, but at the same time she sensed that the presence was closer, almost directly behind her chair. Her nostrils caught a sweet scent of perfume, and she recognized it as the odor that had permeated her bedroom 4 days before. Startled, Kathy could actually feel a body pressing against hers, clasping its arms around her waist. The pressure was light, however, and Kathy realized that, as before, it was a woman's touch, almost reassuring. The unseen presence didn't give her a sense of danger, not at first. Then the sweet smell became heavier. It seemed to swirl in the air, making Kathy dizzy. She started to gag. then tried to pull away from a grip that tightened as she struggled. Kathy thought she heard a whisper, and she recalls something deep within her warning her not to listen. "No!" she shouted. "Leave me alone!" She struck out at the empty air. The embrace tightened, hesitated. Kathy felt a hand on her shoulder, making the same motions of motherly reassurance she had felt the first time in her kitchen. Then it was gone. All that remained was the odor of the cheap perfume. Kathy slumped back into her chair and closed her eyes. She began to cry. A hand touched her shoulder. Kathy jumped. "Oh, God, no! Not again!" She opened her eyes. Missy was standing there, calmly patting her on the arm. "Don't cry, Mama." Then Missy turned her head to look back at the kitchen doorway. Kathy looked too, but there was nothing there. "Jody says you shouldn't cry," Missy said. "He says everything will be all right soon." At 9 that morning, Father Mancuso had awakened in the North Merrick Rectory and taken his temperature. The thermometer had still read 103 degrees. But at 11 o'clock, the priest suddenly felt better. The cramps had disappeared from his stomach, and his head felt clear for the first time in days. Hurriedly, he slipped the thermometer back under his tongue. 98.6 degrees! His fever was gone! Suddenly, Father Mancuso felt hungry. He wanted to eat ravenously, but knew he should ease back into his normal diet. The priest made tea and toast in his kitchenette, his mind ticking off all the things that had been backlogged from his heavy work schedule. He forgot completely about George Lutz. By the same time, 11 a.m., George Lutz had no thoughts for Father Mancuso, Kathy, or his brother-in-law's wedding. He had just made his 10th trip to the bathroom, his diarrhea unrelieved. Jimmy's wedding and reception, an expensively catered affair for 50 couples, was to be held at the Astoria Manor in Queens. George would have a lot to do at the hall, but right now he couldn't have cared less. He dragged himself back down the stairs to his chair by the fireplace. Kathy came into the living room to tell him his office in Syosset had telephoned. The man wanted to know when George planned on coming into work. There were surveying jobs that needed his supervision, and more of the building contractors were beginning to complain. Kathy also wanted to tell him about the second eerie incident in the kitchen, but George waved her off. She knew it would be pointless to try and reach him. Then, from upstairs, she heard the noise of Danny and Chris fighting in their bedroom again, both boys screaming at each other. She was about to shout up the staircase at them when George bolted past her, mounting the steps 2 at a time. Kathy couldn't bring herself to go after her husband. She stood by the bottom of the stairs and listened to George's shouts. In a few minutes there was silence. Then the door to Danny and Chris's bedroom slammed, and she heard George's footsteps coming back down. He stopped when he saw Kathy waiting. They looked at each other, but neither spoke. George turned and went back up to the second floor, slamming the door to his and Kathy's bedroom. George came down a half-hour later. For the first time in 9 days, he had shaved and showered. Dressed in clean clothes, he walked into the kitchen where Kathy was sitting with Missy. The little girl was eating lunch. "You get her and the boys ready by 5, he said. Then George turned and walked out. At 5:30, Jimmy came to pick up his sister and his best man and the children. They were due at the Astoria Manor by 7. From Amityville to Queens, the Sunrise Highway was the fastest way, and the trip to Astoria normally took an hour at most. The roads were reported to be icy from the recent light snow, however, and it was a Friday night. Traffic would be heavy and slow. Jimmy had played it safe by arriving early at the Lutzes. The young bridegroom looked resplendent in his military uniform, his bright face shining with happiness. His sister kissed him excitedly and invited him into the kitchen to wait while George finished dressing. Jimmy took off his raincoat and then, from his coat pocket, proudly pulled out an envelope packed with $1,500 in cash. He had paid out most of the money at the manor some months before. This was the balance due. He said he had just withdrawn the money from his savings account, and it just about wiped him out. Jimmy put the money back into the envelope and returned it to his raincoat pocket, leaving the coat on the kitchen chair beside him. George came down, neatly clad in a tuxedo. His face was pale from the diarrhea, but he was freshly combed, his dark blonde beard framing his handsome face. The two men went into the living room. George had let the last of his fire burn itself out, and now he poked around the ashes looking for any leftover embers to tamp out. The children were dressed and ready. Kathy went upstairs to get her coat. When she came down, Jimmy disappeared into the kitchen to get his raincoat. He returned a moment later, hoisting it over his shoulders. "Ready?" George asked. "Ready as I'll ever be," Jimmy answered, automatically patting his side pocket to check on the envelope of money. His expression froze. He shoved his hand into the pocket. It came out empty. Jimmy searched the other pocket. Again, nothing. He tore off the raincoat, shaking it, then turned out every pocket in his uniform. The money was gone. Jimmy ran back into the kitchen, Kathy and George following. The three looked all over the room, then began an inch-by-inch search of the foyer and living room. It was impossible, but Jimmy's $1,500 had completely disappeared. Jimmy became frantic. "George, what am I going to do?" His brother-in-law put his arm around the distraught Jimmy's shoulder. "Take it easy. The money must be around here somewhere." George moved Jimmy to the door. "Come on, we're running late now. I'll look again when I come back. It's here, don't worry." Everything just welled up within Kathy, and she let go, crying. As George looked at his wife, the lethargy that had gripped him over the past week fell away. He realized how hard he had been on Kathy. For the first time, he wasn't thinking only of himself. Then, in spite of the calamity that had just befallen Jimmy, regardless of the weakness he still felt in his loins from the diarrhea, George wanted to make love to Kathy. He hadn't touched her since they had moved into 112 Ocean Avenue. "Come on, honey. Let's go." He gave his wife a pat on her behind. "I'll take care of everything." George, Kathy, and Jimmy got into Jimmy's car. The boys and Missy clambered into the back seat. After closing the door, George stepped out again. "Just a minute. I want to check Harry." He crossed to the rear of the house. As he walked in the winter's darkness, George called out, "Harry, you keep your eyes open, you hear?" There was no answering bark. George came up to the wire fence of the compound. "Harry, you there?" By the reflection of a neighbor's light, he saw that Harry was in his doghouse. George unlatched the gate and entered the compound. "What's the matter, Harry? You sick?" George bent down. He heard slow canine snoring. It was only 6 p.m, and Harry was fast asleep. Chapter 9. December 27th. The Lutzes returned home from the wedding at 3 a.m. It had been a very long night. It began with the mysterious disappearance of Jimmy's $1,500, and several other incidents during the evening hadn't added any particular joy to George's appreciation of the happy event. Before the wedding ceremony, George, the other ushers, and the bridegroom had taken communion in a little church near the manor. During the ritual, George became violently nauseated. When Father Santini, the pastor of Our Lady of Martyrs, Roman Catholic Church, gave George the chalice of wine to drink, George started to sway dizzily in front of the priest. Jimmy reached out a hand to his brother-in-law, but George brushed it off and dashed towards the men's room at the rear of the church. After he had thrown up and returned to the hotel, George told Kathy he had actually become queasy the moment he had entered Our Lady of Martyrs. The reception ran fairly smoothly. There was plenty of the food, drinking, and dancing usually associated with an Irish wedding, and everyone seemed to be having a good time. George had to go to the bathroom only once, when he thought his diarrhea might be returning, but generally he wasn't too uncomfortable. Kathy's brother and his new bride, Carrie, were leaving for their honeymoon in Bermuda directly from the manor and would take a cab to LaGuardia Airport. George would be driving Kathy and the children back to Amityville in Jimmy's car, so he didn't drink too much. Then came the unpleasant moment of settling up with the hall's catering manager. Jimmy, his new father-in-law, and George told the man of the unexpected loss of all the cash, but promised they would pay him his money out of their wedding gifts. Unfortunately, when the traditional "congratulations are in order" was spoken, most of the envelopes left on the table in front of the bride and groom contained personal checks. The actual cash amounted to little more than $500. The manager was upset, but after a few minutes of haggling, agreed to accept 2 checks from George for $500 each, one from his personal checking account and the other drawn on George's surveying company's account in Syosset. George knew he didn't have the $500 in his personal checking account, but since the next 2 days were Saturday and Sunday, he would have time to cover the draft on Monday. Jimmy's father-in-law quickly conferred with his relatives and scraped up enough cash for his new son-in-law to pay for the honeymoon. Luckily, the plane tickets were already paid for. The wedding party broke up around 2, and the Lutzes headed home to 112 Ocean Avenue. Kathy went up to bed immediately while George checked on the boathouse and the dog's compound. Harry was still asleep, stirring only slightly when George called his name. When he bent to pat the dog, George wondered if Harry was drugged, but then dismissed the thought. No, he was probably just sick. Must have eaten something he found in the yard. George straightened up. He'd have to take Harry to the vet. The boathouse door was secure, so George returned to the house, locking the front door. As he went to the kitchen, he glanced down at the floor, hoping to spot the missing envelope of money. No luck. The kitchen door and windows on the first floor were all locked. George climbed the stairs to his bedroom, thinking about his wife in their warm, soft bed. Passing the sewing room, he noticed the door was slightly ajar. He thought of the children. One of them must have opened it before they left the house. He'd ask them the next morning when they woke up. Kathy was sleepy but waiting for him. During the evening she had gotten her husband's vibrations and was eager for his touch. George hadn't touched her since they had moved in. Usually they had made love once a night from the day they were married in July, but from December 18th to December 27th, George hadn't made a move in her direction. But now the children were fast asleep, exhausted from their late evening. She watched George undress, and all the misgivings of the past few days melted from her mind. He slipped under the heavy blanket. "Hey, this is wonderful!" George reached for Kathy's warmth. Alone at last, as they say. That night, Kathy had a dream of Louise DeFeo and a man making love in the very same room she was lying in. When she awoke in the morning, the vision remained with her. Somehow Kathy knew that the man was not Louise's husband. It was not until several weeks after she and her family had fled from 112 Ocean Avenue that she learned from an attorney close to the DeFeos that Louise actually did have a lover, an artist who lived with the family for a while. Mr. DeFeo must have known about the affair and informed the lawyer. In the morning, Kathy took the van to go shopping in Amityville, while George drove the children in Jimmy's car to pick up the mail at his office in Syosset. He even gave Harry a ride, telling his employees he would be in on Monday for sure. They came home to find Kathy putting groceries into the kitchen refrigerator. She had also brought back a load for the basement freezer. Kathy bemoaned the fact that prices were higher in Amityville stores. "I thought they would be," George shrugged. "Amityville is more affluent than Deer Park." By then it was after 1 o'clock. Though Kathy wanted to make lunch, she still had to transport the additional frozen foods and meat into her freezer in the basement. George volunteered to put together sandwiches for himself and the children. While Kathy was in the basement, the front door bell rang. It was her Aunt Teresa. George had met the woman once before at his mother-in-law's, before he and Kathy were married. Teresa had been a nun at one time. Now she had 3 children, but George never did learn the exact reasons for her departure from her order. Now the former nun stood in the doorway, a short, thin woman in her early 30s, plainly clad in a worn, black wool winter coat and galoshes. Her face was tired but ruddy from the cold. The weather was bright and clear, the temperatures hovering in the low teens. Teresa told George she had taken the bus to Amityville and walked from the station. George called down to Kathy that her aunt had come to visit. She said she'd be right up and told George to show Aunt Teresa around their new home. The children greeted their great-aunt silently. Teresa's grim face forestalled their natural inclination toward friendliness. Danny asked to go outside with Chris. "Okay," George agreed, "but you have to promise to stay within range of the house." Missy ran down the stairs to the basement. George noted how sad Teresa looked when the children didn't respond to her. As he conducted Teresa around the first floor, pointing out the formal dining room and the huge living room, George became aware of a chill in the house, a clamminess he hadn't noticed until Aunt Teresa came. She agreed that it had seemed rather cold when she entered the house. George looked at the thermostat. It read 75 degrees, but George knew he'd have to kindle the fire again. They went up to the second floor. Teresa glanced disapprovingly at the smoked mirrors behind George and Kathy's bed. He could read her thoughts. She believed that such a blatant display smacked of vulgarity and wanted to tell her that the DeFeos had left the mirrors, but he decided to let the subject pass. The woman was still a nun at heart. Teresa followed George to the other rooms. She admired all the new space they had, but when she and George stood outside the sewing room, Aunt Teresa hesitated. George opened the door for her. She backed up a few feet, her face turning pale. "I won't go in there," she said, turning her back to him. Had Teresa seen anything through the open door? George looked into the room. There were no flies, thank God, or Kathy's reputation for house cleaning would have suffered an irreparable blow. But George could feel the room was ice cold. He looked at Teresa. She was still standing implacably, her back to the room. He shut the door and suggested they try the top floor. When it came time to examine the playroom, the former nun balked again. "No," she said, "that's another bad place. I don't like it." Just as George and her Aunt Teresa came down, Kathy came up from the basement with Missy. The 2 women hugged each other, and Kathy, guiding her aunt towards the kitchen, said, "George, I'll finish up downstairs later. I want to transfer some of the canned goods into a closet I found down there. We can use it as a pantry." George went to the living room to build up his fire again. Teresa hadn't been in the house for more than a half-hour when she decided it was time to go. Having expected that her aunt would stay for supper, Kathy was disappointed. "George can drive you back," Kathy offered, but the older woman refused. "There's something bad in here, Kathy," she said, looking about. "I must go now." "But Aunt Teresa, it's so very cold out." The woman shook her head. She stood up, pulled her heavy coat about her, and was heading for the front door when Danny and Chris came in with another young boy. The three children watched Teresa nod to George and kiss Kathy lightly on the cheek. As she strode out of the door, Kathy and George looked at each other, at a loss for words at the woman's strange behavior. Finally, Kathy noticed her sons and their new playmate. "This is Bobby, Mama," Chris said. "We just met him. He lives up the street." "Hello, Bobby," Kathy smiled. The little dark-haired boy looked about Danny's age. Hesitantly, Bobby stuck out his right hand. Kathy shook it and introduced George. "This is Mr. Lutz." George grinned at the boy, shaking his small hand. "Why don't you three all go upstairs and play?" Bobby paused, his eyes darting about the foyer. "No, that's all right," he said. "I'd rather play down here." "Here?" asked Kathy. "In the foyer?" "Yes, ma'am." Kathy looked at George. Her eyes carried the unspoken question, "What's wrong with this house that makes everybody so uncomfortable?" For the next half hour, the three boys played on the foyer floor with Danny's and Chris's new Christmas toys. Bobby never took off his winter jacket. Kathy went back to the basement to finish making the closet into a pantry, and George returned to the living room fireplace. Then Bobby stood up and told Danny and Chris that he wanted to go home. That was the first and last time that the boy from up the street ever set foot in 112 Ocean Avenue. The basement of the Lutzes' house was 43 by 28 feet. When George first looked it over, he came down the stairs and saw off to his right batten doors that led to the oil burner, hot water heater, and the freezer, washers and dryers left from the DeFeo estate. To his left, through another set of doors, was a playroom, 11 by 28 feet, beautifully finished in walnut paneling, with recessed fluorescent lights in a dropped ceiling. Directly in front of him was the area he planned to use as his office. A small closet opened into the space beneath the stairs, and between the staircase and the right-hand wall, plywood panels formed an additional closet, extending out about 7 feet, with shelving that ran from the ceiling to the floor. This walk-in area, George thought, made good use of what would otherwise be wasted space, and its proximity to the kitchen stairs made it a most convenient pantry. Kathy was working in these closets. When she stacked some large, heavy canned goods against the closet's wall, one of the shelves creaked. One side of the plywood paneling on the rear wall seemed to give a little. She moved the cans aside and pushed against the panel. It moved farther away from the shelving. The closet was lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The bulb's reflection shone through a small slit opening, just enough to give Kathy the impression that there was an empty space behind the closet, under the tallest section of the stairs. She went out to the basement and called to George to come down. He looked at the opening and pushed against the paneling. The wall continued to give a little more. "There isn't supposed to be anything back there," he told Kathy. George removed the 4 wooden shelves, then shoved hard against the plywood. It swung all the way open. It was a secret door. The room was small, about 4 or 5 feet. Kathy gasped. From ceiling to floor, it was painted solid red. "What is it, George?" "I don't know," he answered, feeling the 3 solid concrete block walls. "It seems to be an extra room, maybe a bomb shelter. Everyone was building them back in the late 50s, but it sure doesn't show up in the house plans the broker gave us." "Do you think the DeFeos built it?" Kathy asked, holding nervously onto George's arm. "I don't know that either. I guess so," he said, steering Kathy out of the secret room. I wonder what it was used for. He pulled the panel closed. Do you think there are any more rooms like that behind the closets? Kathy asked. I don't know, Kathy, George answered. I'll have to check out each wall. Did you notice the funny smell in there? Yeah, I smelled it, George said. That's how blood smells. She took a deep breath. George, I'm worried about this house. A lot's happening that I don't understand. George saw Kathy put her fingers in her mouth, a sign that she was scared. Little Missy always did the same thing when she was frightened. George patted his wife on the head. Don't worry, baby. I'll find out what the hell that room is all about, but we can use it as an extra pantry. He turned out the light in the closet, shutting out the sight of the rear wall panel, but not obscuring the fleeting vision of a face he glimpsed against the plywood. In a few days, George would realize it was the bearded visage of Ronnie DeFeo. Chapter 10. December 28th. On Sunday, Father Frank Mancuso returned to the rectory after celebrating Mass in the Sacred Heart Church. It was only several yards from one building to the other, but the priest felt his recent weakness as he walked in the cold air. In the rectory's reception room there was a visitor waiting for him, Sergeant Al Gianfrido of the Amityville Police. The two men shook hands, and Father Mancuso led Gianfrido to his quarters on the second floor. I'm glad you called me, the priest said, and I appreciate that you came. That's all right, Father. It's my day off this week. The big detective looked over the priest's apartment. The living room was filled with books that overflowed the bookcases onto tables and chairs. He took a stack off the couch and sat down. Father Mancuso wanted to warm up, and he had no liquor in his rooms to offer the policeman, so instead he made some tea. While it brewed, he got right to the point of his request for Gianfrido's visit. As you know, he began, I'm concerned about the Lutzes. That's why I asked Charlie Guarino to contact somebody in Amityville to check if they were all right. The priest walked into his kitchenette to get some cups and saucers. Charlie reminded me that they're living in the house where that unfortunate DeFeo family was slain. I've heard about the case from some friends of mine, but I don't really know how it happened. I was on that case, Father, the detective interrupted. So Charlie told me when he called back the other night. Father Mancuso brought the tea and sat down across from Gianfrido. Anyway, I had a hard time falling asleep last night. I don't know why, but I kept thinking about the DeFeos. He looked up at Gianfrido, trying to read the expression on his face. It was difficult, even though Father Mancuso had years of experience in probing people for facts, fancied or real, from his patients or from the petitioners who came before him in court. He didn't know whether to reveal what had happened to him on the first day at 112 Ocean Avenue or on the telephone to George. Gianfrido quickly read the priest's thoughts and solved the problem. You think there's something funny going on in that house, Father? I don't know. That's what I wanted to ask you. The detective put down his cup of tea. What is it you're looking for? A haunted house? You want me to tell you there's something spooky about the place? The priest shook his head. No, but it'll help me if you can tell me what happened the night of the murders. I understand the boy said he heard voices. Gianfrido looked into a pair of piercing eyes and saw the priest was troubled. He cleared his throat and put on his official voice. Well, basically, the story is that Ronald DeFeo drugged his family at dinner on November 13th, 1974, and then shot them all with a high-powered rifle while they were out cold. At his trial, he did claim a voice told him to do it. Father Mancuso waited for more details, but Gianfrido had finished his report. That's it? The priest asked. Gianfrido nodded. Like I said, that's it, basically. It must have wakened the whole neighborhood, Father Mancuso continued. No, nobody heard the shots. We found out about it later when Ronnie went into the Witch's Brew and told the bartender. The Witch's Brew is a bar near Ocean Avenue. The kid was stoned out of his head." Father Mancuso was confused. "You mean he used a high-powered rifle to kill 6 people, and no one heard all that noise?" Gianfrido thinks it was just about then that he began to feel nauseous in the priest's apartment. He felt he had to leave. "That's right. People in houses on both sides of the DeFeos said they never heard a thing that night." Gianfrido stood up. "Isn't that rather peculiar?" "Yeah, I thought so myself," the detective said, slipping on his overcoat. "But you gotta remember, Father, it was the middle of winter. A lot of people sleep with their windows shut tight. At 3:15 in the morning, they're dead to the world." Sergeant Al Gianfrido knew the priest had more questions, but he didn't care. He had to get out of there. No sooner was he outside the rectory than he threw up. By the time he returned to Amityville, Gianfrido felt the uneasiness passing. At first he thought of driving past 112 Ocean Avenue, but changed his mind. Instead, he headed home, rolling up Amityville Road. He drove past the Witch's Brew on his right. The Witch's Brew was a hangout for a lot of the kids in town, especially during the season when Amityville was filled with summer house renters. But now, on a December Sunday afternoon, Amityville Road, the main shopping street in town, was empty. The pro football playoffs were on television, and the regulars were at home, glued to their sets. As he rode by, Gianfrido didn't really notice a figure going into the Witch's Brew. The detective was a good 50 feet beyond before he swerved his police car and braked to a stop. He looked back, but the man was gone. The shape of the body, the beard, and the swaggering walk were the same as Ronnie DeFeo's. Gianfrido continued to stare at the doorway to the club. "Ugh, I'm getting jumpy," he muttered. "Who needs that priest?" The detective turned around, jerking the gear shift into drive, and pulled away from the curb, burning rubber like a hot rodder. Inside the Witch's Brew, George Lutz ordered his first beer. He wondered why the bartender stared at him when he sat down at the bar. The man opened a bottle of Miller's and was pouring it when he stopped. He looked as though he was about to say something to George, but then went ahead pouring the beer. George looked around him. The Witch's Brew could have been any one of a number of bars George had seen in his travels as a Marine colonel and as a surveyor working the small towns and villages of Long Island. Dimly lit, the usual garish jukebox, the smell of stale beer and smoke. There was just one other customer in the place, down at the very end of the long mahogany bar, absorbed by watching a television set above the bar mirror as an announcer described the first half action of the football game. George sniffed, took a gulp of his beer, and looked at himself in the mirror behind the bar. He had to get out of the house for a while, be by himself. He couldn't get a handle on what was happening to his family. The little bits and pieces that he would recognize later on were still too isolated for him. George couldn't understand what was wrong with the children since they moved into the new house. In his eyes, they were wild, unmannered. That had never been the case before, not when they lived in Deer Park. He thought Missy was acting strangely. Did he really see a pig in her window the other night? And where was Jimmy's money? How could it simply disappear in front of them? George finished his beer and signaled for another. His eyes returned to his image in the mirror. He recalled now, earlier that week, he'd been sitting like a dummy in front of the fireplace, then standing and staring in the boathouse. Why? And now this business with that red room in the basement. What the hell was that all about? Well, Tomorrow he'd begin to dig into the background of his house. The first place to do that would be the Amityville Real Estate Tax Assessment Office, where he could look at the record of improvements that applied to the property at 112 Ocean Avenue. "Yeah," he muttered to himself, "and I gotta get to the bank and cover that check. Can't let that bounce." George drank down the last of his second beer. At first he didn't notice the bartender standing in front of him. Then he looked up and saw the man waiting. George covered his glass with his hand to signal that he didn't want another. "Excuse me, mister," said the bartender. "Are you just passing through?" "No," answered George. "I live here in Amityville. We just moved in." The bartender nodded. "Well, you are a dead ringer for a young feller from around here. For a moment I thought you was him." He rang up George's money. "He's away now. Won't be back for a while." He put the change on the bar. "Maybe never." George took the money and shrugged. People were always mistaking him for someone else they knew. Maybe it was the beard. A lot of guys wore them these days. "Well, see you around." He headed for the entrance to the Witch's Brew. The bartender nodded again. "Yeah, drop in again." George was at the door. "Hey," asked the bartender, "by the way, where do you move into?" George stopped, looked back, and pointed toward a general direction of the west. "Oh, just a couple of streets from here. On Ocean." The bartender felt George's used beer glass slipping from his hand. When he heard George's final remark, 112 Ocean Avenue, it dropped from his hand and crashed on the floor. Kathy was waiting for George to come home. She sat in the living room by the Christmas tree, not wanting to be in the kitchen nook by herself for fear of meeting up with that invisible something that reeked of perfume. The children were up in the boys' bedroom watching television. They had been quiet most of the afternoon, absorbed in an old movie. By the delighted laughter that drifted down to her, Kathy was sure it was Abbott and Costello. Now she was trying to concentrate on where Jimmy's money could be. Again, Kathy and George had gone over every square inch of the kitchen, foyer, living and dining rooms, and closets, looking for the envelope. It couldn't have just vanished into thin air. No one would have possibly been in the house to take it. Where the devil could it have gone? Kathy thought about the presents in the kitchen and shuddered. She forced her mind to think of other rooms in the house. The sewing room? The red room in the basement? She began to get out of her chair, then stopped. Kathy was afraid to go down there alone now. Anyway, she thought, sitting back down, she and George hadn't seen anything but the red paint when they were in there. She looked at her watch. It was almost 4 o'clock. Where was George? He had been gone over an hour. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement. One of Kathy's first Christmas gifts to George had been a huge 4-foot ceramic lion, crouched, ready to leap upon an unseen victim, and painted in realistic colors. George thought it was a pretty piece and had moved it to the living room, where it now sat on a large table beside his chair near the fireplace. When Kathy turned and looked fully at the sculpture, she was sure she had seen it move a few inches closer towards her. After Sergeant Gianfrido had left Father Mancuso's apartment that afternoon, the priest became angry with himself. He hated the way he was handling the Lutz situation and resolved to break his obsession with the whole affair. For the next several hours he dove into issues that were coming up in court the following week, poring over caseloads that had piled up. Realizing he had important decisions to make that would affect people's lives, he now cleared his mind of abstractions like Gianfrido's unsatisfactory explanation of the DeFeo murders and the doubts he had about the Lutzes' safety in that house. As he worked, he slowly became aware that he was regaining his strength. The weakness he had felt in the wintry air was gone. It was now after 6. He was hungry, and he reminded himself that he hadn't had anything to eat or drink since that cup of tea with Gianfrido. Father Mancuso put down a file, stretching his body, and went into the kitchenette. In the living room, the telephone rang. It was his private number. He picked it up and said, "Hello?" There was no answer, only static crackling from the receiver. The priest felt a chill run through his frame. As he held the telephone in his hand, he began to perspire, recalling his last phone call with George Lutz. George was listening to the sharp, snapping pops on his own telephone. It had rung while he was in the kitchen with Kathy and the children. Finally, after no one answered his repeated hellos, George slammed the receiver back on the hook. "How do you like that? Some wise guys on the other end playing games." Kathy looked up at her husband. They were eating supper. George had shown up just a few moments before. He told her he had taken a very long walk around the town, and he was convinced the street they lived on in Amityville was the nicest. Kathy thought George looked better for having got out of the house. She felt foolish about wanting to mention the lion, and forgot the incident now that George was upset again. "What happened?" she asked. "There was no one on the other end. That's what happened. It was just a lot of static." He started to sit down again at the table. "You know, it was just like the other time when I tried to talk to Father Mancuso. I wonder if he's trying to reach us." George went back to the telephone and dialed the priest's private number. He waited until it had rung 10 times. There was no answer. George looked at the electric clock over the kitchen sink. It was exactly 7. He shivered a little. "Don't you think it's getting chilly in here again, Kathy?" Father Mancuso had just taken his temperature. It was up to 102 degrees. "Oh, no," he moaned. "Not that again." He began to take his pulse, holding a finger on his wrist. The priest started to count when the big hand of his watch was exactly on 12. He noted it was 7 o'clock. In 1 minute's time, his heart beat 120 times. Normally, Father Mancuso's pulse ran about 80 beats per minute. He knew he was going to be sick again. George left the kitchen for the living room. "I'd better put some more wood into the fireplace," he told Kathy. Kathy began to get that depressed feeling again. Then she heard a loud crash from the living room. It was George. "Who the hell left this damned lion on the floor? It almost killed me." Well, thanks for listening to this week's episode, and I hope you'll join us next week for another installment of the Amityville Horror. And until then, have a great week, everyone.